Alright guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to the Fiero triple build. We're going deep into the chassis here in part 3. We're going to be working on all sorts of paint work and effects, and we're going to be concentrating on Fiero Blue's chassis. So let's get started and go right to the paint booth. Okay, now we're going to get started with Fiero Blue's rack. We're going to paint it with some Vallejo aluminum to give it a nice flat metallized appearance similar to what the real rack has. So join me while I do a little painting. Okay, now I'm going to paint the subframe. This is actually for Fiero Red. For Fiero Blue, I painted the subframe dark iron, but I want to give these two cars a slightly different characters from each other. So the Fiero Red subframe is going to be semi-gloss black like the rest of the underside, just to give a little more differentiation between the two and give each one its own little character. Now, when I painted the axles, I painted them all with the Vallejo aluminum, but I don't know, something about that color, it was just a little too bright. It's a fantastic paint and I love using it, but for this purpose, it just seemed to be a little too bright to me. So I picked the next color in the 4-pack metal paint set, or is it 5-pack? It's either a 4 or 5-pack, I don't know, I lost count. And I used dark aluminum for the axles, and I'm much happier with the slightly darker toned metallic paint color for the axles. Alright, so here we go, the finished product. Take a look guys, and you can see how different these two colors are. The aluminum is much brighter while the dark aluminum has just a darker metallic tone to it. I think it looks quite a bit more realistic than having a super bright axle under there. Okay guys, we've been doing a little more work on Fiero Blue chassis here, and as everything was going together, I just all of a sudden got the inclination to make real radiator hoses, as I wasn't really happy with, well, that's not attached, with the direction I was headed with the radiator hoses as they were made in a kit. If you saw in Fiero Gray's chassis build, the hoses don't exactly reach where they are supposed to, and it doesn't look realistic enough. So I went ahead and I made the radiator hoses using a little bit of rubber heat shrink tubing, and added the clamps with bare metal foil. And as you can see, we have the lower hose attached to the bottom of the radiator, the upper hose attached to the top of the radiator, and let's take a look at it. from underneath, and you can see the two hoses going right to the radiator, and underneath the subframe they connect to the tubes in the real car. In this car, not exactly. It was very tricky getting this hose, the upper hose on the left side, to connect with the radiator, to with the coolant tubes going to the back of the car, and even trickier on the passenger side hose for the lower hose of the radiator. And after going through all the effort to try and make them connect, I realized that you can't even see that. So the hours I spent trying to make this work were pretty much pointless, as you really can't see anything about where they join up, as the one on the left actually does join up to the coolant pipe. The one on the right doesn't, but you'll never know that from looking at it. Once I realized that, it made the installation of the hoses much easier. So this chassis is almost done. I still have to work on how exactly I'm going to lower the car. I have an idea, which we'll see when that time comes. Here we have our subframe with our exhaust system mocked up on it. As you saw with the painting, the exhaust is done with the Alclad airframe aluminum. Or that, I think it was, no, Alclad polished aluminum. And you saw the painting of the muffler and the catalytic converter. That's done in Tamiya titanium silver, just to give a little color differentiation to the exhaust. And here we have the results of all of our work on the Fiero red chassis. As you can see, all the colors, just like Ronaldo has in his real car, really make all the details stand out on this chassis. It's really turning out to be a really interesting build to match his car. And there's Fiero Blue. You can see them both together. And now we're going to continue to work on Fiero Blue, as I'm going to be making the coil springs. So we're going to walk through that, making the coil springs on this one, and you'll see exactly what it takes to make those springs work. Okay, now what we've done is we've painted what are supposed to be shocks black, because this one here, Fiero Blue, is an 86 or 87 car, which didn't have the shocks between the shocks between the control arms. They were actually placed behind the control arms and attaching to the wheel well. So what we did was, or what I did, I keep saying I painted them flat black so they'd be a little less visible when everything's together. And I'm in the process of making the coil springs. And these coil springs are going to sit, I'm going to use that shock to hold the coil springs in place, so that when we install our steering assembly, and so we can into the car, and boom, we have ourselves, let me see, coil springs. And as you can see, the flat black shock just kind of fades into the background. And once we glue everything together like that, we'll have coil springs in the front of the car. I think that's going to look really cool. Now, I'll have to paint the coil springs, as I think the springs in his car are red. I think the springs are red in both cars, much like the sway bar is. So I may have to paint him red. I'm going to have to check my reference photos that he sent me. But that's going to look very cool with real coil springs in. Now, to make the coil springs, really very easy. Anybody can do this. I mean, if I can do it, anybody can. I take some of my 20 gauge bead wiring, which you can get in any Hobby Lobby. And basically all I do is I wrap it around a paintbrush with a similar diameter to the shock. And just spin that around, and there we have the makings of several more springs there, which are going to be added to the front steering gear of the Fiero Red, which is an 88 Fiero, which actually did have the shocks mounted between the control arms. So at least that's going to be accurate. So I'm going to go ahead and cut these free, and then we'll be back. Alright guys, after a little bit of fabricating and paint work, we now have all of our springs for the front suspension on both the 88 and the 86 Fiero. Okay, now here we have Fiero Blue's front steering assembly with the springs installed. The springs are painted in a gloss black so that they stand out a little bit, while the center post is in flat black so that it doesn't. Let's see if I can give you a little more light on this subject so you guys can see. I think it looks pretty good. Now, Fiero Red, from the pictures that Romaldo sent me, he's got black shocks in Fiero Red. So I did paint those with a gloss black. And I'm just going to wait for that to dry before I plop on the red springs. Hey guys, here's just a quick look at what a difference detail painting makes. Here we have both sets of axles for Fiero Red and Blue. One is fully detailed, the other one is just painted in its base color. And look at what the difference is. Even though you may not be able to see everything, just the little peek that you can get it makes it worth all this extra detailing to me. Alright guys, the chassis of Fiero Blue is almost complete. You can see here we have the entire rear suspension installed. And just have to install the driver's side rear suspension, which we see here completed. Now, for those of you building this kit, just going to give you a little tip on that'll make your lives a little bit easier when you're putting this together, as there are multiple pieces. Well, there's actually two pieces here, but on those two pieces you have 1, 2, 3, 4 attachment points that are going to hold this thing in place, and they have to be glued in each individual area here. So one little tip to doing that is the shock or the strut and the axle assembly with the hub are two separate pieces. What I like to do is I friction fit the hub, the axle into the hub. I'll show you here on the one for Fiero Red that is not complete yet. You see that slot right there? That's where the strut will fit in. So what I would do is friction fit that, then take it and install it. Where are we? Install it into the car, just on a friction fit. You're going to find that it'll stay together pretty well, especially with all the paint on it. Get it into position you want, as you'll find that this strut will move forward and back. So get it into its final position, then apply your glue on the hub. Now once you have it in position, you can maneuver the strut so that it seats firmly. Then what I do is I apply Tamiya thin cement to the joint where the strut and the hub meet, and let it dry in that position so that when I'm ready to glue the entire assembly in, it's already in its installation position, already glued together, which leaves one less glue joint or glue contact point that I have to worry about. And now I only have the remaining 3. But the best part about it is that this is now positioned exactly where it needs to be for the axle and strut assembly to be installed right into the vehicle. Okay, now we have the assembly glued into the car. What I do is I glue the base of the shock of the strut first, then put a drop of glue where the axle enters the transmission. Now I'm going to let that sit and cure, and then the final glue point on both sides will be that tie rod link to the frame, which will be the last thing that I glue in to finish installing the rear suspension. Alright guys, so chassis number 2 is complete. We have Fiero Blues chassis finished, all the details added, suspensions installed, engines installed, exhaust is installed, looking pretty good. Have a nice shiny polished look on the exhaust. I really wanted that so that the polished exhaust would stand out from everything else that's under there. And then we have a nice matte finish to the muffler and the catalytic converter, just to signify the different metals that were used. You can see our suspension components are painted blue, similar to what Ronaldo has on his real car. Here we have the front suspension with our coil springs installed. Let's see if we can zoom in on that. We have our radiator with real rubber radiator hoses. Much more realistic than what the kit comes with. All the details are painted on the underside. Our engine's installed and good to go. Maybe adding 1 or 2 more details as we go along. Here's our engine compartment. Still needs a little bit of detail painting in there and a few more items installed, but the chassis and suspension are complete. Now you may note on this one, the subframes are a slightly different color. I wanted to add just a little more variations to the underside of this car. And so I painted them with a dark iron as opposed to just black. And I think it's kind of nice. I think it's kind of just makes them stand out a little bit. The other car I did in a more traditional all black. But I thought this would give us a little more visual interest under there. So we are complete here. Let's take a look at that compared to the test shop build. As you can see, what a difference all the detail work makes. And all the paint work. All the components stand out more. I really like the look of the test shop build, as it's more like a, really to me it looks more like a technical drawing than anything else. But nothing beats having all of your details in there and just having them stand out and giving you so much to look at. Everywhere you look, every time you look at it, there's going to be something new and interesting to see. So that's going to end this video where we finish off chassis number 2. And now we get to start on chassis number 3 for Fiero Red, where we're going to dive into that and go into everything that's getting done on that one. Alright guys, I will see you on the next one.